to Cullinan Center. However, Anchor had already been closed down in 2016. Mr. Ngqondwane did not know anything about this. And I later go on to describe how his body was found. And I talk about how Ms. Dladla found the body of her brother. I move on to talk about many others, Ms. Tejani, Ms. Mumalo, Ms. Pangela. I write about the description of Ms. Boitumelo Mangena. These mental health care users and others were deprived of the comfort and certainty that their families could have been provided and moved from the place that they had lived for a long time to a facility where they died. Mental health care users were indeed dehumanized, and they and their families treated most carelessly. And at the close of this scornful tale of every deceased bodies were distraught families who had to find the remains of their loved ones and bury them with their very meager financial resources. And there were survivors. Besides 144 mental health care users who died as a result of their move out of life Esidimeni facilities, 1,418 other patients were exposed to torture, trauma, morbidity, amongst other results, but survived. They have been returned to life Esidimeni facilities for continued care. Of the known survivors, the state was unable to ascertain the whereabouts of 44 mental health care users. They remain missing persons. Short of death, the survivors, and so too their family members, were exposed to trauma, morbidity, and to torture to which the deceased mental health care users succumbed. Families of several survivors found their voice and came before the hearing to narrate the ordeal of their loved ones and their own pain and suffering. The account that follows are a mere glimpse of the torture that the survivors lived through, and are additional to the conditions that at NGOs where most health survivors were users. And I go on at great length to describe the circumstances of Mr. Kanyuseli Banzi, Mr. Sizwe Nkosi, Mr. Sibusiso Ngwenya, Ms. Nochabe, Ms. Baloy's elder sister, Ms. Tlatle, Mandla David Khadebe. And I detailed and record their stories with considerable detail. The important human stories, and harrowing as they are, I found you'll find the courage to go and read a description of the circumstances and conditions under which those who still live have survived. The circumstances of the mental health care users who survived the Marathon Project are expectedly many, varied and uneven. There are indeed differences in the kind and extent and impact of the morbidity, trauma and even torture the patients on the one hand and the families on the other had to withstand. But equally, there are strong and stubborn common contours that are traceable across the experience of mental health care users spawned by the project. Next, I tend to describe the government's obligations towards mental health care users. And I do so because the knowledge thereof were singularly absent within the government itself and perhaps within our state. Now, there's no rift between the parties over the obligation of the government towards mental health care users. They are sourced first and foremost from our Constitution. applicable domestic legislation and policy, all understood in the light of our country's international obligations. Our Constitution leaves no doubt that we are bound by our properly assumed international obligations. And when interpreting domestic legislations, we must prefer a construction that is consistent with international law. And despite the preeminence of our Constitution, it is more convenient to dispose of international obligations quickly and hopefully to get to the outcome. First are international law obligations. The starting point must be the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And its preamble reminds us, and I quote, the recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family, the code ends. And the declaration warns that disregard and contempt for human rights have resulted in barbarous acts which have outraged the conscience of mankind, close quote. These are words which were said nearly 100 years ago. For now, let it suffice to record a few pointed provisions of the